Well, it's fortuitous timing that you should mention working with people from different backgrounds and maybe different locations, even outside of my own district. Because I just came from Reading on Franklin Street.
Oh, wow.
And I was just on the phone with Tommy Calderone's office on the other side of the aisle, if you will. And I don't even like to use that phrase. I always say roads don't begin and end in my district. 422, 222. All right, they go through here like the turnpike, and they're on their way to somewhere else. So if we're going to work cooperatively on a number of different fronts, highways, for example, has anybody ever seen that as a Republican or Democratic issue? We all drive the same kind of cars, and we all hate the same kind of potholes and roads. And so I don't really go out of my way to try to, let's see, how am I going to find the middle ground? I look for issues that bring the community together and say, how can we coalesce around something? For example, I started the Berks Military History Museum. And when we had our opening day, now that is Mark Gillen, the private citizen, but it does cross-pollinate because I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee in the State House of Representatives. And there was only one legislator who had a primary speaking role, and it was Senator Schwank. I asked her to speak. She represents the community, she represents the area, and she has returned the favor, if you will, many times over. There was a highway signing ceremony on 176, which is a stone's throw from where we're sitting right now, but she and I both represent that area, which, by the way, that means the voters said, I like Gillen, I like Schwank. It is possible to do that, all right, because we overlay a significant portion of geography together. Now, a portion of my district lies outside of the county, northern Lancaster County, through the beauty of redistricting. I ended up with a portion of northern Lancaster County, which, by the way, if I can be a flow of consciousness, has become a flashpoint and become very jaded on a partisan basis. The Republicans drew these maps. Well, this Republican voted against those maps. It was a December vote in 2011, and there was no small stir that I wasn't voting with the team for the map. I took one look at the map at the congressional district that I lived in, and it wasn't a big decision-making process. It wasn't done on a partisan basis. It was done on the basis the community was being disenfranchised because those maps weren't compact. They were bizarrely drawn, and I was advised there may be consequences for me if I didn't vote with the team. So there are going to be times where you find that middle ground that doesn't always go over really well, even on your side of the aisle. I think so much is made of the visceral environment that we live in. And if you took a snapshot of some of what we actually do, you might have a different perspective, not you personally, but the community as a whole. I'm on the Veterans Affairs Committee, I'm on 4 committees, I'm on the Education Committee, Labor and Industry Committee, and the Agriculture Committee. I can never remember partisan rancor for the Ag Committee, for example. There may be differences of opinion, there may have been distinctions on policy or how to solve a problem, but there wasn't any rancor. Probably the best friend, and unfortunately he passed away, Sid Kavula, probably one of the best friends I had in the State House of Representatives. I was at his funeral in upstate Pennsylvania. He was a Democrat, Sid Kavula. He died not many weeks ago. And he and I used to get together, and some elements of our family, depends on who was available. His son was a reenactor at the World War II weekend, and he'd come down and he'd participate in that. And as it was approaching, I'd walk over to his seat and his side, if you will, of the building. But it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to visit a Democrat, as I'm going to go see a friend. When we sit around at Thanksgiving or Christmas time, there are members of my own family, my mother included, that don't have the same party registration as I do. But the topic is not Harrisburg or Washington, just as the topic is not the politics of the day when I'm with my friends in the State House, whether it be the Ag Committee or some other committee. the Veterans Affairs Committee. It is our affinity for what we want to see accomplished to benefit the lives of our constituents. That's not a partisan issue. And I think if there is any success in what I'm doing and what we're doing together, we have decided philosophically that we want to be constituent focused. I have independent constituents, the non-affiliated Republicans, Democrats, and I'm sure there's a variety of others in that mix. I do not view them through the lens of partisan politics. And I think the great mistake that we're making today is that we are classifying and categorizing entire groups of people all being of the same mindset. Hey, I have to run as something, okay? You don't have an option here. There's 0 independents elected to the State House. There's 0 independents elected to the congressional delegation. There are 0 independents elected to statewide office, whether it's governor or United States senator. All right, I didn't game this system. I didn't create that. I'd love to change it. It is what it is. And so I have to appendage myself to a party label. But that doesn't mean that I have to be a partisan. And the policy I love, the working with the constituents, I really enjoy. My committee assignments, I cherish. But the politics, I hate. All right? And when you're running every 2 years, it is hard to get away from that political season. And the most political statement that I'll make, very oftentimes, you'll get sworn in, and a few months after you're sworn in, somebody is running against you. All right? And so one of the ingredients, I think, in trying to be successful is be quick to forgive. Because there's going to be friction. There's going to be sparks. I mean, it is what it is. There's no getting away from it. I don't expect to see campaign ads where an opponent is giving you flowery oratory, how much they appreciate it. And I think maybe a parenthesis around all this ought to be discerning during campaign season. I would ask the electorate, I would ask constituents, people in the Commonwealth and the country, be discerning. All right, the way ads are packaged, the way mail pieces go out, negative seems to be the word of the day in politics. But above all else, don't make the mistake of ascribing all of the sins of an individual or several individuals in politics today and say that everybody in that party has that quality. It's not even true in our own families. There's so much difference. My wife can hardly believe that when my brothers come over, these are actually my brothers, One looks like he's in a motorcycle gang-ish. It's so hard to believe that these are actually your brothers. There's so many differences within our family units, but when people get together and we have family reunions, the discussions are on backyard issues. They're on living room issues. And the truth is, that's the way it is throughout our community. I was a local borough councilman, and I think the partisan lines tend to blur when you get a lower level of government. Not unimportant, but I was a borough councilman. It was eons before I even realized who were the Republicans or the Democrats were. That just wasn't the discussion. All right, we got, how do we solve this codes violation problem here? We need to upgrade this section of our sewer line. These are things that people were interested in. I guarantee that people in my community were much more interested in a small borough in barking dogs than barking that was coming from Washington. Because that's where they lived. That was quality of life. It was a Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. But I do not think that you can manufacture what I'm describing here. I do not think that you say, this is the template, because I believe it rises out of a heart that wants the best for people. And I do think that we ought to set our ambitions aside. I don't have any ambition for anything else. I've got 5 wonderful daughters, a lovely wife. I have an extended family, a supportive community around me. I enjoy what I'm doing. But I think aberrant political ambition, what's the next rung on the ladder, leads to some of the ills that we hear about politically. Now, I answered every question you were getting ready to ask, so you don't have to ask anymore now.
You did awesome, but I do have questions.
Go ahead, though.
Okay, so the World Wide Web, the internet. Do you think that part of what we're seeing today is directly caused by the fact that we have so much information and we don't always know how to tell what's real and what's not?
Which is why I use the word discernment. All right? I think you ought to be multi-sourcing. I texted somebody the other day, maybe it was yesterday. I said, do me a favor and fact check that. That number just doesn't sound right to me. I'm not saying more often than not I'm right, but when something doesn't sound right, and I ask somebody to check it out, often they'll come back to me and say, oops, that was exposed for the fiction that it actually was. I don't eat a steady diet of anything when it comes to me physically. I try to have a variety of activities I engage in. I have a variety of friends from all different walks of life. I think when you are looking at any outlet, be it left, right, doesn't matter what the media mode is, if you're taking in a steady diet, informationally, food, or whatever, you're going to end up a little bit distorted in your perspectives. And I think you're going to end up seeing one group as the good guys and another group as the bad guys. It's going to become an us versus them. And for some organizations that are trying to build membership, dues, donations, or whatever it happens to be, they've got to keep people pumped up out there. There's always the next crisis that needs to be addressed. And you only need to send $10, $15, or $25, to solve this problem. And look, advertisers are paying attention to listenership, to viewership. So a lot of this is dollar driven. And so I think we've got folks in the media that are cultivating relationships with a particular constituency. And if that's all you're listening to, watching, going online to, I think you're apt to rob yourself of the benefit that you could have of hearing other perspectives and points of view. You may not adopt them as your own, but I think it's important to recognize that that's not the only view in town, the one that you're tuning into.
That's awesome. Okay, so now to reiterate.
Did you get that on tape?
I did.
She said awesome. Oh, that's not what I said.
So to reiterate, you're saying we need to be more discerning and we need to pay more attention. We should check our facts. We should realize that the media is looking at their bottom line for money because that's what they do. They entertain as well as inform. And we should be looking at more than one source. So from that, is there any one thing that you would say to people about the way things are now and the way they should be and how to get there?
Well, I always like to conduct myself in a way that my thought process revolves around, what if my mother was in the room listening to me, say this? Or my children, very oftentimes, I have 5 daughters, they're around the corner, peering in. Or as a Christian, deity is oversighting all that goes on. There's a number of different checks and balances that need to be in place. I think you have to have a firm conscience about things. I think there's a lack of ethics, if you will, and that goes without saying. But that's part and parcel of human nature. So we're all going to be challenged in that area. And I think it's important not to project, I expect perfection from you. I always tell the staff, you're allowed to make mistakes. I don't reward it or encourage it or induce it. I just say, no worries. We need to move past that. And so when we are conducting ourselves, we have to recognize that we have a stewardship. And that's preeminent. That when I look out these windows here, these are the people who pay the bills. And I think that is foundational and underlies everything that I do in this office, in this position that I have. They are paying the bills. And I have accountability toward people outside of this office. And that ought to steer me in the direction that I need to go ethically. I owe them a full day of work. I owe them legal and ethical behavior. I have a responsibility to them to work with the people that they've elected on the other side of the aisle. And there's just as much validity in Democrat as there is Republican ideas. We have both parties represented in this county. Mark Rossi and I have worked on issues together. I've co-sponsored his legislation relative to abuse. Tom Caltagirone and I will be doing a factory tour tomorrow because I think it's important for jobs in Reading. Judy Schwenk and I have stood shoulder to shoulder as recently as 2 days ago in the rotunda of the Pennsylvania State House of Representatives for a Wreaths Across America ceremony. Gold Star mothers were there. They gave their sons and daughters to this community and this country. They paid an ultimate sacrifice. Blue Star mothers, their children are serving overseas and they've been deployed. These are all foundational issues. I'm answering in principle because if we lose sight of what I just stated there, then we're apt to abuse our office. It's not about me. It's not about my next election. It's not about someone I favor politically. And by the way, I think hyper-partisanship is different than being affiliated with a particular party. All right? I'll say this publicly, and I'll probably get myself in trouble for doing it. Okay? Have I always voted straight party? No. My mother, who's a Democrat, has she always voted straight party? No. See, now I'm getting her in trouble too. Okay? She's in Philadelphia and she's 92 years old, so she's not going to worry about it as much. We have to honestly take a hard look at the individual credibility, the pedigree, the experience of an individual candidate. We cannot just walk into voting booths blindly because we're going to further the problem. We're going to exacerbate a problem that we already have. I don't work in an office in Washington. But this last election, there were a lot of shadows of Washington, D.C. being cast on the outcome. All right? I'm not interested in accruing a benefit politically for what happens in Washington. I'm certainly not interested in accruing a liability. But I do believe, I don't think this is a political moment, but it's just a realistic purview of the outcome of the last election. A lot of my colleagues got wiped out on the ballot, okay, on our side, yeah. I did not. I think people went in with some level of discernment and said, well, I think this person operates on an independent basis. I think they're constituent focused. I hope that's the way they view me. But we cannot condition our public behavior with outcome electoral in view. We cannot be moving about saying, what will be the consequences if I vote this way, do this, or say that? Simply do the right thing, all right? And trust the discernment of the public. We can't be lifting our finger to the political wind for everything that comes out of our mouth. Frankly, the very conversation that we're having, most people sitting in a public office wouldn't necessarily even want to have. All right, because they're afraid of the consequences. All right, how will this be used? I'm suspicious. Somebody's doing an interview with me. All right, and so you probably even encountered that yourself. Like, I don't know if there's a long line of people, coming to your office saying, I want to do one of these interviews or return the phone call. But accessibility is important. Anybody who wants a meeting with me, they'll get a meeting with me. All right? You need to sit and talk to me about something. I'm welcome to have that conversation, even with people that I know disagree with me, or in certain seasons they may even be working against me. That's life. I still have a responsibility to represent them, and so the forgiveness part, and I often use the phrase that. Probably because I have a duck that follows me around on our farm. I said, that's water on a duck's back. I'm not, if somebody says something to me about what's going on out there, or something they read or saw online, I said, that has no influence on me. And it doesn't. And I think if you look at your life in office through the lens perpetually of what can I do to build a sense of community, which is always sadly lacking, because a lot of the consequences of the breakdown in community or family or neighborhoods is felt at another level of government in the loss of volunteerism. It's been in the news recently. The declining numbers of volunteers, particularly in rural areas, emergency medical services, or around here for sure, volunteer firefighters. And whatever I can do to bring the community together is going to end up with residual benefit for the taxpayer. Now, I know one of the questions, at least that had been posed early on, is what are you working with your colleagues on both sides of the aisle on? There's universal agreement on property tax elimination in this community. Now, how you get there and what are the alternative taxes that you apply, every Republican and every Democrat in Berks County, as far as I know, the immediate border counties close to the Berks County line are on board with that particular proposal. And so I think it's more interesting to read about conflict, and I'm not saying local media works on the basis of sparks, but if you ever walk through the magazine aisle area of Walmart and you start noticing these magazines where there seemingly is very bizarre things happening, it's always, conflict, or someone's, you at least you thought you knew they were married and having children, but they're getting divorced, and all this conflict, and people must like to read about these various bizarre things allegedly happening. In fact, I was behind somebody in the checkout, and the magazine said something about Kennedy, JFK, and Elvis were spotted like walking somewhere recently. And I did something I'd never done before. I said to the person, I said, they picked it up. I said, do you believe, that they're still alive? She goes, no. I'm like, oh boy. I set myself up bad for that one. And then she looked around, just she turned and leaned over and said, I don't think Kennedy's still alive, but I think Elvis is still alive. So, but there's something in people that it maybe not so much enjoying the lie, all right, because she actually believes it's true, but something bizarre, something strange. People are consuming information at a rate they never had before from a variety of sources that were unimaginable in another generation. And at some point, you're going to have to set up an internal filtering system and say, all right, you know what? I got to separate the wheat from the chaff here. And if you don't do that, you're going to end up in one of these polar opposite camps. And then there's no bringing them together, because one side views the other as barbarians, and they're going to destroy the country. In fact, it's their goal to destroy the country. All right? All the while forgetting, and they're trying to raise children in this community. They're trying to educate their children in this community. They'd like me, my 5 daughters, I'd love for them to stay and remain. We're trying to do productive things with veterans at the Veterans Museum, preserve artifacts, preserve their stories. I never once, of course, never once did I ask whether somebody was a Democrat or Republican, and I don't even recall anybody ever volunteering that information. I've been an emergency medical technician, I'm not running now, for 30 years. I never once asked somebody, what's your party affiliation? I was a correctional officer. I never once asked anybody, okay, what's your party affiliation? How did you end up here? So in our everyday life, it is not a substantial component. But at the 30,000 foot level, where we got Washington and Harrisburg, it's all the rage. It's all the conversation. And then I think we get duped into believing that's the way that people interact on an everyday basis. They do not. Not at all. I was in Reading. I probably spent time with 30 or 40 people. Nobody once asked, they knew I was a state representative. Nobody once asked me what my party affiliation was. It just doesn't come up. we're 24/7. I'm in Lowe's, I'm in a store, I'm out with my family. You're on duty. I was in church Sunday. The pastor came over, and he had something related to government work that he was, wanting to run through me. But it was never on a political basis. And so we have these tremendous differences between the two major political parties. We ought to take more time to find out the actual interaction, particularly since we're talking state legislature right now, that the great affection that I have for my colleagues, regardless of where they sit in the building. And if you're talking agricultural issues, we are not throwing chocolate milk containers at one another, okay? We are finding out how we sustain agriculture in this state. How do we increase consumption, particularly dairy? It's under stress. There are no Republican and Democratic cows, okay, that I know of, all right? Maybe they're more likely to be Republican cows in Lancaster. I'm not sure.
That's awesome.
Well, now I think you've said it all.
Okay, all right, we're good.
I like ending on cows.
That's perfect, actually.